Linda Thompson, the woman who stood beside Elvis Presley when fame turned from a blessing into a burden, has finally broken her silence. She was there when the music roared and when the lights dimmed, through the laughter, the heartbreak, and the unraveling of the man the world worshipped. For decades, she kept her memories locked away, refusing to trade sacred love for gossip and headlines. Was it loyalty that bound her silence, or wounds too painful to revisit? What really happened behind Graceland's gates when the cameras stopped flashing, when the fans went home, and when Elvis was no longer the king, but simply a man desperate for peace? Tonight, the veil lifts. For the first time, we step into the private world of Elvis and Linda, a world filled with devotion, despair, and secrets too heavy to carry alone. This is not the story of a legend. It is the story of the man she loved, and the truth she has carried for nearly half a century. In the summer of 1972, Linda Thompson had no idea her life was about to change forever. At 22 years old, she was more than just a Southern beauty queen. Having been crowned Miss Tennessee, she was admired not only for her striking looks, but for her calm demeanor, intelligence, and quiet grace. She had grown up with simple values, raised in a family that believed in hard work, faith, and humility. Yet, despite her modest upbringing, she carried herself with the poise of someone who belonged on any stage or in any room. Nashville and Hollywood had already begun to take notice, but destiny had far more in store. That fateful summer evening, Linda accepted an invitation from a mutual friend, Bill Browder, later known as country star T.G. Shepherd, to attend a midnight movie screening at the Memphian Theater. It wasn't unusual for Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, to rent out the entire theater so he could watch films with his inner circle away from the public eye. To Linda, it was simply an exciting chance to spend time with friends. She never imagined she was walking into the presence of the most famous man alive. When Elvis arrived, his entrance was quiet, almost subdued. Linda later recalled that he didn't seem like the radiant, smiling performer the world knew. He appeared tired, even grumpy, carrying the weight of exhaustion from constant tours, performances, and endless demands. But then something shifted. His eyes met hers across the room, and suddenly his whole demeanor softened. The stern expression gave way to warmth, and for a moment it was as if the noise of the world fell away. From that first glance, the connection between them was undeniable. After the movie, instead of mingling with the crowd or surrounding himself with admirers, Elvis chose to sit with Linda. They began to talk, not about fame, not about music, but about life. He told her stories of his childhood in Tupelo, the deep loss he felt after his mother passed, and the loneliness that often haunted him despite being adored by millions. Linda, unlike so many others, didn't treat him like a god on a pedestal. She didn't try to flatter him or impress him with who she was. She simply listened. She listened with patience, with empathy, with the kind of genuine care that Elvis rarely found in his world of yes men and fleeting acquaintances. For hours, they spoke in hushed tones, trading stories and emotions like two ordinary people who recognized something familiar in one another. By the time the night bled into morning, the star and the beauty queen had forgotten the world outside those theater walls. Elvis felt understood in a way he hadn't in years, and Linda felt seen, not just for her beauty, but for her heart. When the night ended, Elvis extended an invitation that would change everything. He asked her to come to Graceland. For most, Graceland was a mythical palace, a fortress where few outsiders were ever welcomed. For Linda, it was a doorway to a life she never dreamed she'd enter. The very next day, she drove up to the iconic gates, where the golden notes of the musical fence glistened in the sun. As they opened for her, she felt both nervous and enchanted. Inside, Graceland was alive with laughter, music, and the presence of history. Gold records lined the walls, the smell of Southern cooking wafted from the kitchen, and rooms buzzed with friends, family, and the constant hum of activity that came with living in the orbit of a superstar. Yet amid the grandeur, Elvis made her feel at home. He greeted her not as a fan or a stranger, but as if she belonged there, as if she had always been meant to walk those halls. Very quickly, Linda's life transformed. Days turned into nights spent in Elvis's company, sharing meals, watching movies, and exploring the vast rooms of the mansion. Before long, she was no longer a guest. She became a part of his everyday life. Moving into Graceland wasn't just about living in luxury. It meant stepping into the deepest parts of Elvis Presley's reality, where joy and sorrow walked hand in hand. Elvis revealed to her the playful, generous, and loving man behind the legend, but also the fragile soul struggling with pressures few could imagine. What began as a midnight movie in Memphis had bloomed into a love story that would define Linda's life forever. Life inside Graceland was unlike anything Linda Thompson had ever known. At first, it felt like stepping into a dream, a living fairy tale where music never stopped and laughter echoed down every hallway. The mansion was alive at all hours of the night. Friends, family, and members of Elvis's tight-knit inner circle, known as the Memphis Mafia, filled the rooms. There were late-night jam sessions, spontaneous gospel sing-alongs at the piano, and endless movie marathons that stretched until dawn. Yet beneath the glamour, Linda quickly learned that life with Elvis was far more complex than the picture painted by outsiders. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she became his confidant, his anchor, and often his caretaker. Elvis had a warmth and generosity that drew people to him. He loved to surprise Linda with small acts of romance, whether it was dancing barefoot in the living room to a favorite song, or decorating rooms together to reflect their playful bond. One of their most famous projects was the Jungle Room, which they transformed into a quirky hideaway filled with exotic furniture, green shag carpeting, and a playful energy that matched Elvis's larger-than-life personality. But the laughter and creativity were only part of the story. Linda also saw the fragile side of Elvis that few ever witnessed. He struggled with insomnia and recurring nightmares, often waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his voice trembling with fear. When those moments came, Linda was always there. She would rub his back, hold his hand, and pray out loud to calm his spirit. She wasn't just offering comfort, she was offering love without conditions. The kind of devotion that reached past the fame and into his wounded soul. Elvis leaned on her in ways that went beyond romance. He began to call her Mommy, a tender nickname that revealed just how much he needed her presence. She, in turn, called him Little Baby Bunton, treating him with compassion and care as though her love alone could shield him from the storms within. For Elvis, Linda represented stability, a safe harbor in a world where he was constantly pulled apart by expectations, demands, and the crushing weight of fame. Yet Linda also began to notice troubling patterns that cast shadows over their happiness. Elvis had developed a growing dependence on prescription medication, a secret carefully hidden from the public but impossible to ignore inside Graceland's walls. At first, she believed it was simply to help him sleep, to manage the exhaustion of his grueling schedule. But as time went on, she realized it went deeper than that. Elvis wasn't trying to harm himself. He was trying to cope with the relentless pressures of being Elvis Presley, a man who had given his entire life to the world. and was left with little peace for himself. Linda never judged him, never scolded him, never threatened to leave. Instead, she chose to stand beside him through the darkest nights, through the hospital visits, through the moments when his body betrayed him and his spirit felt heavy. Those close to Elvis later admitted that Linda's care may have been the reason he lived as long as he did, that her steady presence bought him time against battles he was slowly losing. But love inside Graceland was complicated. The house was filled with opulence, with gold records on the walls and luxury at every turn. But for Linda, it often felt like living inside a cage. Every hallway carried echoes of responsibility. Every day demanded her constant presence. She was not only the woman Elvis loved, but the one he leaned on for survival. And while she poured herself fully into keeping him afloat, she began to sense her own dreams slipping quietly into the background. Graceland, for all its beauty, had become both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where love and burden lived side by side. As the months at Graceland turned into years, Linda Thompson discovered that her love for Elvis Presley was as deep as it was demanding. Their relationship was filled with magic, tender moments that felt almost like scenes from a dream. Elvis could be playful and childlike, full of energy and mischief. He loved to sing for her late into the night, sometimes performing entire gospel sets in the living room, his voice echoing through the mansion as if he were praying with music instead of words. They would dance together with no audience but the shadows on the walls, laughing at inside jokes, sharing whispered promises, and wrapping themselves in the warmth of each other's company. But beneath those moments of joy was an unshakable reality. Elvis was fighting battles too heavy for one man to carry, and Linda was often the one absorbing the weight. She wasn't just his partner in romance, she had become his nurse, his emotional compass, and sometimes his only shield against the darkness that stalked him. He relied on her for comfort when nightmares tore through his sleep, when his body ached from exhaustion, and when the pressures of fame pushed him to the brink of despair. Elvis's dependence on prescription medication grew worse during this time, and Linda watched as it slowly chipped away at his health and spirit. He was not seeking escape in the way outsiders might have believed. Instead, he was desperately searching for relief. From the insomnia, from the depression, from the loneliness that came with being both idolized and isolated. Linda understood, but it broke her heart. She prayed for him, encouraged him, and begged him to take better care of himself. But even when he promised her he would, those promises faded as quickly as they were spoken. She stayed longer than most women would have. Her loyalty was fierce, her devotion unwavering. When people asked why she endured so much, Linda said it was because she wasn't trying to fix Elvis. She was simply there to love him, to stand by him no matter what. Yet, the longer she stayed, the more she realized how much of herself she was losing in the process. Graceland, with all its gold and grandeur, began to feel like a golden cage. Every day revolved around Elvis's needs, his moods, his battles. Every decision was shaped by what would keep him stable, what might protect him from breaking under the weight of his own life. Linda's identity, her goals, her dreams, slowly, they dissolved into the background. She had once been a young woman filled with ambition, with the promise of a future wide open before her. Now, she was the caretaker of a man who belonged to the world, and in giving him all of herself, she found there was little left for her. Still, she loved him with everything she had. Elvis knew this, and in his rare moments of vulnerability, he admitted that she was the best woman he had ever been with, the one he had searched for all his life. Those words meant everything to Linda, but they also cut deep, because she knew love alone would never be enough to quiet the storms inside him. No matter how much she gave, there was always a cloud looming over their happiness, a shadow that even the most powerful love could not erase. She lived with the constant ache of knowing she could not save him. And slowly, a quiet voice inside her began to whisper a haunting question. How long could she keep pouring herself into him without losing herself completely? The burden of love was becoming heavier, and Linda knew that one day she would be forced to choose between staying by Elvis's side or saving her own soul. By 1976, Linda Thompson had reached the most agonizing crossroads of her life. For years, she had poured her heart and soul into Elvis Presley, standing by him through the highs of his brilliance and the lows of his battles. But the toll it took on her spirit was becoming unbearable. She had loved him with a devotion few could understand, but love had become a double-edged sword, both her greatest gift and her deepest wound. The man she adored was slipping further into exhaustion and dependence, his once vibrant energy dimming as his body began to break down under the strain of endless tours, sleepless nights, and the hidden struggle with prescription drugs. Linda had begged him to rest, to find balance, to take control of his health. Elvis would look into her eyes and promise he would. And for a fleeting moment, she believed him. But each time the cycle repeated, and the promises faded like smoke in the wind. What hurt her most was not anger, but sorrow. The realization that no matter how much she loved him, she could not save him from himself. She also longed for a different kind of life, one that felt increasingly impossible within the walls of Graceland. Linda dreamed of motherhood, of raising children in a home filled with peace and stability. But how could she bring a child into a world dominated by chaos, exhaustion, and constant worry? She also had to face the painful truth that Elvis was not always faithful. While she knew he loved her in his own way, she also knew she was sharing him with other women, including Mindy Miller. Those betrayals cut deep, making it harder for her to envision a future together. And yet, it wasn't jealousy that drove her decision. It was survival. Linda later said she felt the shadow of death following them, whispering in her ear every night. She was only 27, and she couldn't ignore the fear that if she stayed, she would soon be a widow, carrying a grief she wasn't ready to bear. That haunting thought pushed her toward the hardest choice of her life. When the moment finally came, it was not a dramatic ending filled with shouting or slammed doors. Instead, it was heartbreakingly quiet. Linda packed her belongings in silence, tears streaming down her face as she prepared to walk away from the man she still loved. Before leaving, she leaned down, kissed Elvis gently on the forehead, and whispered words that would stay with him forever. "If you ever need me, I'll be here." It wasn't an empty promise. She meant it. Even though her footsteps carried her away from Graceland, her heart remained tethered to him. Elvis, despite his flaws, had been the great love of her life, and leaving him was not about abandoning him, but about saving herself from drowning in a storm she could no longer control. For years afterward, people speculated why Linda left. Some accused her of chasing fame. Others whispered that she had grown tired of the pressure or wanted another man. But those closest to her knew the truth. Linda didn't leave out of ambition or bitterness. She left because she had no choice. Love had become a weight too heavy to bear, and if she stayed, she feared it would destroy her completely. Walking away from Elvis Presley was the hardest thing Linda Thompson ever did. And though her body left Graceland, her love never truly did. In the months after Linda Thompson walked away from Graceland, her heart remained heavy with worry. Though she was no longer by Elvis's side, she could not silence the part of herself that still felt responsible for his well-being. Late at night, when the rest of the world was quiet, the phone would ring. And on the other end was a voice she knew better than her own. But it was not the voice of the king of rock and roll. It was not the charismatic performer who lit up arenas and charmed millions. Instead, it was Elvis, stripped bare, vulnerable, weary, trembling with a sadness too deep to hide. In one of those calls, he confessed words that would haunt her forever. "You were the only one who truly cared about me. I know that now." For Linda, those words pierced like a knife. They carried both love and unbearable sorrow, a reminder of the bond they had shared, and the emptiness he felt without her. She had left in hopes that Elvis might find strength on his own, that the absence of her constant care might push him to confront his struggles. Instead, his voice told her the opposite. He was slipping further away, his loneliness growing, his pain deepening. Each call left Linda shattered, unable to decide if leaving had helped him or doomed him. She replayed their years together in her mind, wondering if her love had kept him alive longer or only delayed the inevitable. She wanted to believe that walking away had been necessary for her own survival, but the sound of his fragile voice made her doubt everything. She couldn't stop worrying about him. Did he eat? Was he resting? Was anyone truly watching over him? She knew Elvis better than anyone, his rhythms, his silences, the subtle signs of when his body was failing him. Without being there to see it for herself, she feared no one else would notice. Her worry grew so strong that she often reached out to Charlie Hodge, one of Elvis's closest friends, and a longtime member of his inner circle. Charlie was a trusted companion, a guitarist who had lived with Elvis for years. Linda called him not just occasionally, but with growing urgency, pleading with him to check on Elvis physically. She asked him to look closely, to make sure he was breathing, to make sure he was okay. Sometimes Charlie reassured her. Sometimes his answers felt too quick, too casual, leaving her with doubts that gnawed at her in the night. One Friday evening in August 1977, just days before Elvis Presley would be gone forever, Linda picked up the phone once again. Her heart was heavy with unease, the kind of worry that refuses to quiet down no matter how hard you try. When Charlie answered, Linda's voice was soft but urgent. She asked him to please go check on Elvis, to make sure he was breathing. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretched long enough to make her chest tighten. Then Charlie returned, saying Elvis was fine, that he was okay. Linda wanted to believe him, but something in her heart remained unsettled. That call would be the last time she tried to reach out before tragedy struck. Only a few days later, Linda's phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Elvis or one of his friends. It was his 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, her voice breaking through the line with screams that would echo in Linda's memory forever. "My daddy is dead." In that instant, the weight of every phone call, every worry, every lingering fear came crashing down on her. Linda was blindsided, crushed by a grief so heavy she could hardly breathe. The man she had loved, the man she had cared for, the man she had left to save herself, was gone, and she would never again hear his trembling voice on the other end of the line. On the morning of August 16, 1977, the world woke to the shocking news that Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer on the planet, was gone at only 42 years old. But for Linda Thompson, the news didn't come from a headline, a radio broadcast, or a frantic television report. It came from the broken cries of a 9-year-old girl. Lisa Marie Presley had called her in anguish, her young voice barely able to form the words, "My daddy is dead." In that instant, Linda's world shattered. She had known deep in her heart that Elvis was on a dangerous path, but the finality of his death felt like being struck by lightning. Nothing could have prepared her for the weight of that loss. Memories came flooding back. Nights spent holding him through nightmares, mornings watching the man behind the legend struggle to get out of bed, phone calls where he sounded like a shadow of himself. And now it was all over. The man she had loved so fiercely was gone forever. The details that followed only deepened her heartbreak. Elvis had been found unconscious in the bathroom of Graceland. Attempts were made to revive him, but it was too late. The king of rock and roll, a man adored by millions, had taken his final breath in the privacy of his home. To the world, it was the end of an era, the death of a cultural icon. To Linda, it was far more personal. It was the loss of the man who had once whispered his fears to her in the middle of the night. The man who called her mommy when he needed comfort. The man who promised her love even when he was surrounded by chaos. She was devastated not only by the reality of his death, but by the lingering question that would haunt her forever. Could she have done more? She had walked away to save herself, but a part of her always wondered if her absence left him more vulnerable, more alone. She thought back to their last conversations, to his trembling words telling her she was the only one who truly cared. She thought about her call to Charlie Hodge just days earlier, begging him to check if Elvis was breathing, and whether that moment had been a warning she should have acted on herself. The grief was unbearable, tangled with guilt and sorrow that she would carry for decades. As the news spread across the globe, millions of fans mourned, but Linda's grief was different. For the world, Elvis was the king. For her, he was the man she had once shared a life with. The man who played gospel songs until sunrise, who filled their nights with laughter, and who leaned on her when the storms of fame grew too heavy. She mourned not the legend, but the human being, the fragile, complicated, beautiful soul behind the myth. Even as the public descended on Graceland, lining the streets, weeping, and holding candlelight vigils, Linda grieved privately, away from the cameras. She didn't want her love for him to be another headline or spectacle. She mourned in silence, carrying with her the weight of what they had shared and the sorrow of what they had lost. For the rest of her life, the day of Elvis's death would remain etched in her heart, not just as the day the world lost an icon, but the day she lost the man who had once been her everything. In the years that followed Elvis Presley's death, the world was desperate for stories. Tabloids filled their covers with sensational headlines, publishers dangled book deals worth fortunes, and television talk shows begged Linda Thompson to appear. Everyone wanted the inside scoop from the woman who had lived with Elvis during some of his most turbulent years. But while others rushed to cash in, Linda remained silent. She refused to turn her memories into spectacle. She didn't run to the media, didn't sign her name to scandalous tell-all books, didn't sit under bright studio lights to dish out stories that would feed gossip-hungry fans. Her silence wasn't born from having nothing to say. On the contrary, she carried within her more stories than most could imagine. But to Linda, what she had shared with Elvis wasn't material for cheap headlines. It was sacred. He wasn't just a cultural phenomenon, not just the king of rock and roll. He was the man who cried in her arms, who whispered his fears when the world wasn't looking, who trusted her with the most vulnerable parts of himself. To take those memories and sell them would have felt like a betrayal. Instead, Linda chose to protect him even after his death. She knew how fragile his legacy was, how easily it could be twisted by the hungry mouths of tabloids, eager to portray him as a caricature of excess and downfall. She wanted to preserve the dignity of the man she had loved, not add to the noise that distorted his truth. Fans speculated endlessly about her silence. Some said she stayed quiet because she still loved him too much to speak. Others claimed she was hiding dark secrets or protecting herself. But the truth was simpler. Linda believed that love meant protecting him, even when he was gone. For her, silence was the purest form of loyalty. Meanwhile, others told their versions of Elvis's life. Some painted him as a tragic figure consumed by drugs, others as a fading star clinging to past glory, and still others as a bizarre recluse lost in eccentricity. Linda hated those portrayals. They reduced him to fragments, exaggerations, or outright lies. She knew the real Elvis, his humor, his tenderness, his generosity, his struggle to balance being both human and legend. By keeping quiet, she felt she was preserving a truth that the world didn't deserve to pick apart. In her own way, she was still standing by him, even decades after walking out of Graceland. But silence did not mean forgetting. Linda carried the memories with her every day, both the joy and the sorrow. She grieved privately, away from the spotlight, and in that grief, she learned to live with a haunting paradox, loving someone so deeply, yet knowing she could never speak of it openly. Years passed, and the world changed. But still, Linda stayed quiet. Only those closest to her understood that her silence wasn't emptiness, but reverence, a way of honoring both Elvis's memory and her own broken heart. For nearly 40 years, she chose not to speak publicly, letting her memories remain locked away like treasures in a chest no one else could open. It was only later, when time had softened her grief, and she felt the world might be ready to hear a different kind of truth, that Linda decided her silence had lasted long enough. Nearly 40 years after Elvis Presley's death, Linda Thompson finally chose to break her silence. In 2016, she released her memoir, A Little Thing Called Life, not to scandalize or seek attention, but to honor the man she had loved. She wrote with grace and compassion, pulling back the curtain on her years with Elvis without tearing down his dignity. Her words revealed not just the legend the world thought they knew, but the tender, complicated man she had held through sleepless nights and comforted through endless storms. He was human, and that's what made him divine, she wrote, capturing the paradox of a man adored as a king, yet fragile as any other. Linda spoke of his generosity, his humor, his childlike spirit, and also his flaws, his mood swings, his struggles, his dependence on prescription drugs. But she never reduced him to his demons. Instead, she showed the balance, the light and dark, the laughter and the sorrow, giving fans a portrait of Elvis more real and more human than ever before. Her honesty struck a chord, reminding the world that behind the gold records and glittering jumpsuits was a man who loved deeply, suffered quietly, and needed connection as much as anyone else. Beyond Elvis, Linda rebuilt her life with resilience and creativity. She appeared in television roles, became a celebrated songwriter, and co-wrote Whitney Houston's classic I Have Nothing, pouring into music the emotions she once carried in silence. She experienced love again, marrying Olympic champion Bruce Jenner, now Caitlyn Jenner, with whom she had 2 sons, and later marrying producer David Foster. Yet, no matter what paths her life took, Elvis remained her greatest teacher of love and loss. Even now, Linda occasionally returns quietly to Graceland, away from the crowds, walking the halls where laughter once filled the night. She leaves flowers not for the king of rock and roll, but for the man she once called Little Baby Bunton. Her story, told with tenderness rather than bitterness, reshaped how many remember Elvis Presley, not as a distant legend, but as a human being whose greatness lay in his humanity.